Hello, all right, and this is Conversations with Microphones. We're talking again to the microphones. It's the conversation where we talk and the microphones listen. I'm Kelsey, and I'm here with Ryan and Nathan again today. We talked last time a little bit about genetic fallacy. We have that pulled up, and I think that we're kind of going to take that into a direction talking about belief and fundamentalism. I think it ties into some of the things we were talking about last time. And I also have a deck of cards in my hand. We're going to pick another logical fallacy or bias. And I'm just going to go ahead and spread these out here. And if Ryan, if you'd like to pick one of those.
Yeah, just go ahead and pick one of these blue ones here.
A blue one. There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. My fallacy is appeal to emotion.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
That's delicious.
Yeah,
That's going to fit right in today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in addition to our genetic fallacy, we'll be talking about appeal to emotion, which is manipulating an emotional response in place of a valid or compelling argument.
Okay. What's the example, too?
The example is Luke didn't want to eat his sheep brains with chopped liver and Brussels sprouts, but his father told him to think about the poor, starving children in a third world country who weren't fortunate enough to have any food at all.
Okay, interesting. And then we got genetic fallacy here as well. You judged something as good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it came. This fallacy avoids the argument by shifting focus onto something's or someone's origins. It's similar to an ad hominem fallacy in that it leverages existing negative perceptions to make someone's argument look bad without actually presenting a case for why the argument itself lacks merit. Example, accused on the 6 o'clock news of corruption and taking bribes, the senator said that we should all be very wary of the things we hear in the media because we all know how very unreliable the media can be. I can't argue that.
Oh, man. Yeah. Sounds an awful lot like somebody currently in office.
But see, like to Kelsey, to your point, you're like catching your bias in real time. So
Right.
It's like you knowing that you have that bias, you would be able to go in and watch a piece of things and just say, okay, I'm going to set that bias aside. It's not going away, but I'm just going to be aware that I have it,
Right.
and then really listen to what's being said and then evaluate it. So I think it's only without the awareness that you have that bias that it really bites you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that, just because you have a bias against something, doesn't mean that it can't be true. And the thing about, fallacy, in this case, the example of, genetics saying, okay, well, just beat up that microphone. So, I mean, just because you look at something from where it came and you say, oh man, if I hear something from Nathan, it can't be true, because, okay, well, it's a genetic fallacy, but that also doesn't mean that I can't be skeptical. It's a fallacy to say that, okay, if Nathan says something, it's not true. But if I hear bullshit out of your mouth 90% of the time, it might start to get more of a bias.
Right, yeah. You
Right.
build a healthy dose of skepticism, but I think that's different than saying, like, well, all Nathaniels are idiots.
Right.
Idiots say stupid things, so therefore Nathaniel will always say stupid things.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where it's important to remember, what the nature of a fallacy is, right? It's based, and that's, I think too, where we get to, all or never, always, things like that,
The hyperbole statements associated with things being like always and never, as opposed to like maybe and sometimes.
Right.
And
I think that is a conspirator with the fundamentalist mindset, the kind of superlative always never way of thinking.
Well, and it's an easy trap to fall into. You fall into that sometimes whenever you're even having arguments with your significant other. Well, you always never, or you never do this thing over here. It's like,
never do it. Yeah.
really? I mean,
And the funny thing that's always being lobbed is like whatever that person is measuring, it's the thing that they do most often that the other person doesn't.
Right.
So it's like, I'm going to ignore the 10 things that you do more than me, and I'm going to pick on this one thing that I do slightly more than you and say, I always do this and you never. Which is a perfect recipe for marriage, by the way, for anyone listening.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, I think that this in particular, the genetic fallacy, is one that I personally see this all the time. I mean, I think that this is probably one of the things that seems to be almost one of the more common ones in our current political landscape. It would seem, because I mean, appeal to emotion, like this other one that I just drew as well from the card deck that you handed out there, is very similar in that it's very common.
I think a lot of times, I mean, and that's where some of these things too, it's like none of these things exist in a vacuum.
No.
You know, when we see conversation all the time, it's not like, somebody says, well, I'm just going to use this fallacy and I'll just stop right there. Like, I mean, it's just like sometimes there's so many intertwined. In fact, out of one of these game cards too, it was,
I think I know where you're going, but I'm not going to interrupt you.
Yeah. Your thinking is bad and you should feel bad. If you've been given this card, it's because the things you said were so full of fallacies and dodgy logic that it would take too long to identify all of them.
Yeah, that's just just no.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
Stop and reassess.
Just stop. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So I think, we talk about some of these things, genetic and appeal to emotion. I mean, I think certainly those can be tied together a lot. I mean, appeal to emotion, I mean, we just see that all the time. Like,
Well, it's interesting to me that appeal to emotion. I mean, I think the interesting thing to me about this, and I'll just kind of give the perspective that perhaps might be the most, maybe something that somebody would think whenever they're reading these two examples. This one in particular, the genetic one, is talking about the 6 o'clock news, and the person is being accused of something, but then he's redirecting and saying, no, the media is saying that I'm doing this, but actually the media is full of lies.
Right.
And it reminds us of a current person in power in a way. And that particular has a very has a right leaning in this political landscape perspective, right? The appeal to emotion, I think, is one that a lot of people might say would actually be kind of on the left-leaning side of things.
Yeah.
Because the left-leaning side of things does kind of think, well, what about all these, the students and their loans and whatever it happens to be, like, oh, well, shouldn't we forgive all of these things and all of this stuff?
And what happens to Joe the plumber? Think about Joe the plumber. Right. He's working so hard.
Well, and I think that...
Not to pick on a particular party, just as an example.
I think that one of the things that I'm kind of riffing on here or trying to say is that I think that these things, they don't appear in a vacuum. And a lot of the times, perhaps maybe one might be... Some things are kind of overutilized in one particular area than another, I think. And you might see that kind of leans one direction or another as well, just based off of what kind of the messaging is from perhaps someone that might be kind of considered an authoritative figure in that space.
Mm-hmm. You raise a really good point, and I know Kelsey and I have talked about this in previous conversations, which weren't recorded. But
shame.
yeah, I know, right? There's this tendency. It seems like the political parties have split more and more progressively along basic personality traits. And so if you have someone who's kind of a doty soccer mom or whatever, the chance of her being super hard right-leaning Republican, it's not zero, but it's not high either.
Right.
And are you going to pit that person against someone who's a lot more choleric and maybe spent some time as a drill sergeant in the military?
Well,
and they're not going to get along just because they have different personalities now?
It's funny you should bring that up. I don't know if either of you guys seen, and I'm not sure how far off topic this gets us, but
well, let's find out.
I know, right?
Let's bring it up.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys have seen the map where they separate out the 2016 election by men, women, white people, people of color, and see how all the states voted according to those things. Like when you look at women, it's almost all Democratic. When you look at men of any race, it's almost all Republican.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, I could try to pull it up here and see if we can find it.
No wonder why no one's getting laid. That explains everything.
No, yeah, right, for sure. Well, and actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I mean, in terms of our conversation about fundamentalism, and I think we also said that we wanted to talk today about how fundamentalism or beliefs essentially sort of become their own religion, right? And so
for sure,
that's another thing too that I've seen a lot lately, where people become so entrenched in a belief that they can't even talk to somebody that has an opposing viewpoint. And so now we've
Right.
seen that more and more, where somebody says, okay, you are on the opposite team of me, and so I can't even stand to talk to you. I don't even want to hear what you say, because I just like, nope, la 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 la, just
Yeah, I'm not listening.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think that's like, so Nietzsche's idea was that God is dead, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people who are non-theist are like, yeah, damn straight. You're gosh darn right, God's dead.
that's a South Park voice for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, you're darn right. But like what Nietzsche was saying is like he was actually making a caution. Like, what happens if we lose the conception of our highest ideals, which is, i.e., God? And what I think we're finding out in the 20th and 21st centuries is you do not need a literal God to have a religious belief. You can have any belief be elevated to the status of religion. No God required is my understanding based on what I've seen. Be interested to get your thoughts on that too.
Well, it's interesting to me because I grew up with kind of a religious perspective, and I think that it was actually Roman Catholic. And one of the things that I noticed with, at least in some of that instruction, they talk about, you talk about the not having another God before that deity in that instance. And then they give different examples. They give societal examples in particular as you're kind of learning this in, this modern era about propping up things like money or perhaps even material things and otherwise. And I think that the concept of having a quote unquote false God or propping things up from a fundamentalist standpoint and using that as a means of worship it would be considered wrong in that kind of moral perspective or that moral hierarchy. And I think that it's interesting to me whenever you think about like kind of what you see now from a fundamentalist perspective. I think that you do see people that will prop up different ideas, possibly even different viewpoints as kind of the viewpoint to have. And, to your point, Kelsey, not being able to even listen to a counterpoint.
Yeah.
It's just not possible because they've already decided that any point beyond that or counter to that is just wrong fundamentally.
Something I've kind of spent quite a few cycles thinking about this recently, because once somebody gets to that point where you basically say, I'm in my bubble and I've locked the door and thrown the key away.
Right.
How do you get somebody to even start giving out of this? And again, we've started to touch on politics a little bit, and I don't see it as a left versus right thing at all, because it can happen. And left, right, up, down, depending on which political map you're looking at.
Any demographic or direction. Like humans are never beyond being too petty to find any reason to quarrel with someone.
This is another thing too. When I hear people talk about sides, I really like the libertarian political map, how they kind of shows a diamond where there's four different things. There's really no sides, and because there's ideologies all over the map, and it doesn't matter what your ideology is, you can get locked into it. That's why we talk about like cults and cultism and stuff like that. And there's lots of different ways that people can get locked into a mindset. And I think, even talking about some of these fallacies are really great for that, because I think that's, these are good examples. That's one of the reasons I really like them, because you can start to use some of these things to try to pull somebody else out of and try to get people kind of thinking in a different way. It's like if you're using some of these techniques or relying on some of these mental handicaps, I'll say, to make an argument, at least here, this is sort of relying on some of the philosophy greatness of our time to say, okay, we've sort of identified these sort of mental laziness or things that are mental laziness, to say, okay, these are bad arguments. So let's identify these things and try to like sharpen our thinking and say, okay, let's make the best arguments possible. And maybe that keeps us from getting too extremist in our thinking, that keeps us from being able to converse with each other a little bit more and understand or accept different ideas and things like that. So
it's like a meta tool.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like when we're talking about how sometimes you do come across somebody that is a fundamental, like has that kind of fundamentalist perspective. They are difficult to maybe pull out of that. How do you in particular like go about doing a conversation with them if you get into that territory. One of the things that sorry, Nathan.
No,
One of the reasons why I bring it up actually is because I do find that sometimes you don't know that you're walking into a bit of a trap, or perhaps
it's a trap.
Right, exactly.
you might actually be just having a conversation about something, and then you just bring up something, and
it's like Danger Will Robinson.
right. Admiral Akbar.
Yeah.
It's a trap.
Yeah. These are not the droids you're looking for.
Yeah. No, that happened to me the other day.
Yeah.
For sure. I just like brought up something and be like, oh no, that's a terrible idea. And here's why I went, whoa.
Like how do you pull yourself away from, or really like how do you bring somebody back to the table as soon as they've had that kind of emotional response?
And I think that's $1 million question. That's what I'm talking about. Is that I've been asking myself that a lot. And I think the techniques that I've found that are best for that, if you first of all, number one is a willingness on your part to engage in conversation, like we said, right?
Yeah.
You can't just say,
right.
"Oh, this person, thinks opposite of me, and I don't even want to try."
Right.
Like, oh my God, there's too much of that already.
Right.
And
yeah,
like,
there really
okay,
is.
even if somebody is completely opposite of you and thinking, I've actually still had really great conversations with those kinds of people. And I think I've actually started drafting up some of my rules of conversation, which I think we'll maybe get to at a later point.
Sure.
I've kind of added a couple more. But there's definitely some things that I've put in of how I address, people and how I have really great conversations with people that I disagree with.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think a lot of it is just acknowledging that, first of all, it is a conversation, not a debate or argument.
Right.
That's kind of like one of the things I've really tried to eliminate is saying, I'm not here to tell somebody that they're wrong. If anything, if it's a conversation, I'm here to listen, and people, this idea of like listening to somebody that they disagree with is like so egregious that they just are like, no, I can't listen to this. That's where I have to plug my ears and put my head in the sand because I can't even bear to listen to it.
Right.
Yeah, there's like a guilt by association going on.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so like a guilt by association, and it might even be one of the cards in there, or at least close to it. There's probably a fallacy or a bias.
I think you might be right. Yeah.
Yeah, but basically it's saying like, hey, I'm trying to think of an example that's not super explosive. So like, let's say that you.
Well, but I mean, take even like if you say in the legal system, like an accessory to murder. If you're driving the getaway car.
Right. So like, you're Ryan and you're a convicted criminal and I'm best friends with you. Well, so if I get into a police situation, they're going to say, hey, look, I know you hang around with this guy and we've got him on all kinds of things. You've got to be doing the same things that he's doing. It's that guilt by association.
Right, okay.
It's like the stink on you, it transfers.
Yeah. Even though Nathan might be a saint and like donates to charity every week and goes to church, and he's really just trying to convert you into being a righteous, holy person.
Perfect.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's any number of situations. I wanted to share a quick anecdote, and I think it's relevant to what you were saying about this kind of like quarreling or even refusing to talk to people, because I think it's at the central. It's so central to so many things. But author C.S. Lewis, he had a book called The Great Divorce. And in that, he was talking about a kind of purgatory. And whether you're taking this literally or metaphorically, it almost gets you the same place either way. So just kind of be open and accept it as true from wherever you're comfortable from taking it. But there's this gray town, and towards the center of the town, everyone's connected. It's by the town square, and they meet, and they're very interconnected.
Is it a gray town?
Yeah, like gray is in like gray buildings, gray everything, like it lacks color.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, it's metaphorical, like if like because usually if you think of a place with color, it's very happy. It's like you're seeing things in a full way.
But they haven't quite descended to the level of being a black town.
Exactly. Okay. Right. Yeah.
Well,
That's
it actually reminds me of Pleasantville. I think there's a movie about that.
So if you think of like the conception of heaven, it usually has white fluffy clouds, which is symbolic of purity, and then black would be the opposite of that, like you're in the pit of despair. And then Greytown is somewhere in the middle, like you're just kind of not committed to either extreme. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And so anyway, some of the people close to the town where let's say the bus stops to bring people to heaven, they have a chance to glimpse something really good because they're connected with other people. But the people further out from the town, what happens is they are more quarrelsome, and they quarrel with their neighbor. And every time that they quarrel with their neighbor, the resolution is to just move further out. They imagine a new house and then just move out to the suburbs. And then eventually they're out like in the middle with a log cabin building pipe bombs.
Doing their own
because,
thing.
because they're so far away from the
right.
center of town,
Sure.
which is like, if you think like their chance to be connected with other people and holy. And so it's like this conception is like people that are kind of like maybe a little bit far out, you might be able to identify that threat, like why they got threatened, because usually that's why we move away from people. We feel threatened about something with our identity, or like our ego is fragile, so it's like we have to move further away out. We have to push other people away. And that's actually the one thing that could save us and make us better. So I think like identifying the threat to their identity is maybe one thing that I identified. And then I also like what you said about acknowledging that it's a conversation, and that, setting that context that, hey, we're here to learn. And, I know the safe space has gotten like overused and played out, but like this idea of psychological safety and making people feel safe to come back into community and conversations with things that scare them, that's not an outmoded idea. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like your thought on there, Kelsey, with respect to not coming into something with an argument standpoint, like not coming in to say, I think that you're wrong, or your position is flawed, or anything like that. To your point, Nathan, like trying to build community and bringing people back to the table has a lot to do with, honestly, trying your best to listen to them as well, understanding their perspective, and really just kind of, I mean, you don't want to use your own fallacies whenever you're talking to them, like the appeal to emotion. Like you could probably use that if you wanted to try to bring them back to the table. But that's really, again, like you don't want to practice that. And but you might have to sit there and listen, understand your responsibility to the conversation has a lot to do with being open to listening to things that maybe you don't necessarily want to hear either. But that's not the point. The point is that you want to understand where people are coming from. And all you're really trying to do is just illustrate or perhaps communicate a differing perspective.
I think that's right. And I'll just interject briefly in here. I think there's a difference between appeal to emotion, where I'm trying to twist your arm to get you to do something by twisting your emotions, and actually really listening to what you're saying and then reflecting your emotional world or makeup back to you to relate and empathize with you.
Yeah.
This is where, I was thinking, as you guys were talking about that, Jonathan Haidt talks about catastrophizing and in appeal to emotion. I think when we talk about fundamentalism, a lot of times in my mind, I also associate that with radicalism. So radicalism being the idea that you are kind of pushed to the fringes, as Nathan was talking about, right? So radicalism would be you being pushed the furthest away from sort of center, if you will, as possible, right? And center is, certainly has a lot of definitions. We talk even about the Overton window, about, what is acceptable or not acceptable. But, for argument's sake, I mean, our discussion's sake.
That's right.
For conversational sake.
For conversation's sake, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Center is, more or less just what is socially acceptable, if you will, right? But the further that you get pushed to the center, and radicalized to sort of a fringe ideology, and fringe being just maybe a small number of people sort of believe the same thing as you, right?
Right.
So you could get radicalized without necessarily being fundamentalist, right? So you kind of believe some of these things are radical ideas, but maybe you're not really sure about it. You're like, okay, yeah, I mean, maybe you got a flat earther out there. It's like, well, maybe it is. I kind of believe some of these things, but I mean, it seems like it could be true, but I'm not really sure what to believe, But somebody that's fundamentalist and radical, radical fundamentalist is like really out there and really sure that that's what they believe. And so sometimes I tie these two things together because to me, somebody who is a radical fundamentalist is particularly difficult to deal with.
They're difficult to talk to.
And I think there's actually, I want to hear what you have to say after this, Ryan, but I think there's actual like an identifiable, objectable danger of why that kind of fundamentalism or fringe view is dangerous. Because if you're closer to the center of town, like you can see things from the baker's perspective, you can see things from the iron worker's perspective, you know, kind of like using the old town metaphor. But the further that you get out, there might be only a couple neighbors that you identify with, or you're like, oh, you're just this fringe group within a fringe group. Well, then what happens if that belief system and system of values collapse? Now you're nowhere. You are in pitch blackness. You have nothing to stand on. You know, and we see that a lot of times with people in society. It's like they get kicked out of a couple of different circles, and then, you know, they're just seen on the street talking to themselves.
Well, what I was going to say was actually to your town perspective. Excuse me. The good concept about that, and we weren't really going to talk about left versus right, but you can think of expanding out from the center in either direction, almost like a circle. And the interesting part about that is that even as you're expanding beyond that, whether you, again, maybe not necessarily thinking about it from right
well,
and
but
left,
you said circle, concentric rings.
Yeah,
right?
concentric
Right.
rings.
Right.
As you're kind of coming out from there, and if you are kind of thinking in that perspective, if you flatten it like the way that a lot of our current political landscape might say, that left versus right or single side, like kind of a side standpoint, those people that are outside actually on the fringes of this particular viewpoint are actually have a lot of similarity. You're talking about that person that's living out in a log cabin making pipe bombs. Well, you know, right versus left, their similarity is that they might actually be both in the log cabin, just on different sides of town,
exactly.
doing the same thing.
Right.
So it's, you know, there is kind of some similarities in that they both, in many respects, chose to move away from kind of a center viewpoint and a humanistic standpoint, and put themselves on the outskirts of their belief systems.
Yeah. Extremists, ironically, have a lot in common,
Exactly.
even if apparently the thing that they're standing on seems to be diametrically opposed.
Well,
Right.
and there's the other thing too. And talking about a circle, I mean, I've actually heard some people talk about that, like, you know, it's kind of like a Pac-Man thing. That's like once you get so far to the right, you actually sort of loop back around.
Back around.
Right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like
yeah.
the extremists, as you get further and further around, kind of maybe sort of get one different way. And
Right,
we've
right.
talked about this too, where, you know, if you look at the libertarian, you know, political compass, you know, they have on the bottom and top, you know, kind of libertarian versus authoritarianism. And this is what I've seen too, even when you talk about political left versus right. I've actually seen that when you sort of get far enough in either direction, I believe that both ideologies start to adopt an authoritarian bent, because as you get further away from the center, you start to believe that the only way that you can get other people to sort of fall in line with your belief system is by force.
Yeah.
And so you say, okay, well, I'm
Right.
for authoritarianism because you should believe what I believe, and if you don't, I'm just going to make you do it, you know? And so it's a
Right.
threat of violence.
For
And
sure.
it's been replicated in history. I mean, you see that across the board. As soon as you get to a kind of a majority viewpoint on that kind of authoritative side, they tend to push with an authoritative figure at the centerpiece, and they try to make that their worldview, and they change their government into that perspective as well.
It seems like there is a discernible point at which things really break, where you're saying, where you go from, okay, this person and myself, we actually want the same things. We just have different ways about going about getting it. And how can we row together in the rowboat of life and get what we both need while cooperating with each other, to seeing like, oh, this person is pure evil. And regardless of what they want, they're never going to go about it the right way because they don't value the same things. You know, they're subhuman, you know, and so therefore any ends will justify the means. If it takes violence to win good over evil, then that's what we got to do. And I think that's why that kind of emotionally charged, in like even in the Christian circles, some people who are outside of the Christian circle looking in saying like, well, you know, you're talking about like onward marching Christian soldier and stuff. You're using this kind of language that's a little disconcerting. You know, like what exactly do you mean by that? You know, and then I think, you know, there's other examples I won't get into, but it's like it's a valid question.
I was just going to bring up too, because I heard you say authoritative. I just wanted to point out a quick distinction. Authoritative could just be from an authority or an official, acknowledging accuracy or excellence, versus authoritarian is favoring absolute obedience to authority. And so this is where it's sort of against individual freedom, using like violence or force. So let me just throw that in there real quick. One of the other things I was thinking about when we brought this up, especially appeal to emotion, is when you get to some of these fringe edges, you were saying, okay, maybe not appeal to emotion to try to, talk with somebody in terms of reasoning with them. But where I think that is, particularly frustrating is if you get somebody that is sort of pushed to the fringes by appeal to emotion, or we're saying like it is appeal to emotion that's gotten into that point. And this is where I brought up Jonathan Haidt and catastrophizing is, especially in the political landscape, we see this so much, and I've heard it from so many different people with so many different ideologies, where it's like you say, oh my God, if you don't do this, the world is going to end, and everything's going to be screwed, and this person is just the worst person that we've ever seen on the face of the earth. And it's like, okay, whoa.
Right.
That is definitely appeal to emotion. And he calls it catastrophizing, where it's just like you've gone so far in your push to emotional appeal that it's just like everything is the worst of the worst. And I mean, that's not, it doesn't even approach logic. But when you have somebody that's sort of been involved with so many of those arguments for a long enough time, how do you start to say, whoa, here's how we can sort of reason through this? I think sometimes it's difficult for people to even hear logical arguments if you've been subjected to that for long enough.
Well, I was actually thinking too, like kind of to that point, whenever you have had a lot of people that have been kind of dealing with the same arguments, the same thought processes, and they've kind of maybe they've tailored their worldview around this, so they kind of have a lot of different perspective or a lot of different examples in their mind. One of the things that I found whenever you try to talk to somebody about it is that they, to your catastrophication kind of idea, catastrophizing, you're kind of left with, if you try to entertain that conversation, they'll just bring up another example and then another example. And I think one of the most difficult things whenever you're trying to talk to somebody in that is that you want to kind of maybe get them to think only in the one subject matter that you're actually talking about, instead of trying to bring in every single example.
Like stay on focus,
right? It's like, instead of having them kind of sit there and just bring in every example. They will. I mean, it happens that, or I shouldn't say they will, but I mean, in my experience, I have seen that there are examples where somebody who has that will bring in multiple examples and kind of just try to machine gun their point across. And the only way I think that you can really do that conversation any justice at that point is to try to bring them back to the center point or back to the point at hand.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it would be one thing if somebody machine guns like valid points or valid examples or valid data, but I think lots of times what you're talking about is somebody's just machine gunning with non sequiturs, things that don't even follow from one thread to another, and so when you do that, you're just like, I mean, to sort of paraphrase another way of putting it, it's just mind diarrhea.
Yeah. There was I won't mention his name just because I don't want this to be a politicized example. But one of the people that I was listening to said, well, if you have 10 arguments and like just pick your strongest one. And then let's all agree that if I can cast doubt or get you to reconsider that one, and that one's your strongest one, then that's the one that we should be talking about. Because it's almost like people are doing like TARP. They're basically bundling a bunch of bad assets and repackaging them to make them look better than they really are. So, yeah, I think that's almost a fallacy in of itself, is like the badly bundled poor arguments.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to talk to somebody that's basically sitting there waiting to unload a machine gun of emotional non sequiturs. But I think that's to your point earlier as well. Like, you have to be able to kind of try to recenter them in a way. Maybe bring it back to the topic at hand. Maybe even remind them. I mean, it's not bad, I think, to remind people the conversation that they're in. I mean,
Right.
it's not.
Yeah,
it's,
no, the context.
Right. I mean, like,
Here's
like,
where
hey,
you are.
I know that you're. I mean, you can just say like, hey, I know that you're very, you're very you've thought this through multiple examples, but what I was trying to talk about was this, and I really want to understand your perspective on this a little bit more before we jump to any other examples.
Yeah.
And that's, getting back to that, I think helps people sometimes to recognize whenever they're going a bit off track. And possibly even again, maybe you can also have a bit more of a grounded conversation that might get them away from some of the fundamentalist views that they might be holding. But you have to, I think, deal with things on a one topic at a time standpoint, because you are talking about somebody in many ways that has, fundamentalism has a lot to do with taking a worldview and basically putting it as this and this only, and this is how I believe, and this is how I think, and this is how I view things from my lens.
I think this is where the genetic part of it comes into play too, because we've spent some time talking about the sort of tribalism of things, and so once in to that point too is sort of the opposite of genetic is the othering that happens. I mean, I guess they're all the same thing, because somebody says, okay, well, because I see you as coming from this camp, it's genetic by saying, okay, you are of a different camp than me, so therefore I will discount everything you say. And sometimes not even trying to refute that by listening to somebody and refuting the actual arguments based on their merits, but sometimes just repeating or parodying other talking points, and I'm kind of getting tired of the word talking point, but it's repeating other people's arguments, just sort of regurgitating them without even thinking about it. And just an example, I go through life sometimes and just even different phrases that I say, not even relating to anything like politics or anything like that. Sometimes I'll just catch myself reiterating a phrase or a saying that people say, and I'm like, what does that mean? Like, why am I saying that? Like, where'd that come from? And just look it up.
Yeah, no, there is like this whole kind of memification that's happening. Mark Manson, he's a popular, I call him kind of like the anti-self-help author, because like it's just believe in yourself, like he that's all baloney, right?
Yeah.
But he talked about Edward Bernays, who actually, I think it was Freud's cousin. And so he essentially is attributed as being the modern father of propaganda. So one of the examples that he gives is that the cigarette company wanted to give the gift of cigarettes to the female population, because in the 1920s that was considered unladylike to be a female and a smoker. So what Bernays did was they're like, well, what you need to do is right in the middle of Macy's Day Parade, which is like the Super Bowl halftime of 1920, is you need to have a bunch of women stop, light up their cigarettes, and call them freedom torches.
Freedom torches.
Exactly. You can see just how twisted it's getting with the language. And sure enough, it worked. Within a few years, most women and the flappers and the feminists of the 1920s had cigarettes in their hand, and it was all emotional. It was nothing rational about it. And we're seeing those tactics of marketing become better and better across not just advertisers, but people in political campaigns as well. They're getting better at that appeal to emotion and advertising to people without people knowing that they're being advertised to, that they're being propagandized to.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up advertising, because I think that's one of the biggest sort of culprits in this, right? I mean, a lot of this, I think, started with advertising. And, when you have advertising that is bombarding people all the time, people start to think, oh, that's acceptable. That's acceptable in the way that we converse and talk with each other. It's like, oh, if I want to persuade you of my viewpoint, I'll just use all of the tricks that I see the advertisers use, because it worked for them.
Here, let me just get into my announcer voice and tell you what you should believe. And it's like, no, that's not what you should be doing.
Please do more of that.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, please. Yeah, and that's what's frustrating, because I feel like I think I was looking at statistics, like we see as many as like 3,000 ads a day.
Oh my
And so
God,
it's like,
really?
yeah, exactly. And it's like, how is that even possible? But it's like, so then, well, for one reason, we're carrying around an advertising device in our
Do
pockets.
you remember where that statistic comes from?
No, but we should look it up. If
Yeah,
you
that
look
would
it
be
up,
good,
it'll
yeah.
come up. I do want to get a source from that because it sounds so outlandish and so ridiculous.
No
And
kidding.
that I understand on its face that it sounds
Oh,
ridiculous.
wow.
It says
Okay.
5,000
Yeah,
ads a
and it's
day.
getting
LinkedIn
5,000 and getting worse.
5,000 ads a
Yeah.
day. And let me go ahead and capture
Yeah,
this.
so I mean, think about that. You're getting 5,000 messages from all kinds of people that you've never met, and then you try and talk with a neighbor and have a critical thinking conversation with them. It's like throwing a pea at a tank. It's like they're just it's changing the way that we think.
Yeah, this article says back in the 70s, the average consumer in the U.S. saw around 500 ads per day. That number has since increased by a factor of 10 to upwards of 5,000 ads. This is in February of 2019.
Yeah, I think this is one of the unintended consequences of making the internet "quote unquote" free.
Yeah.
Because now you have to pay. You have these $1 billion estimated companies.
Well,
I won't
I mean, that's
mention
even
them.
what it says, like $20 billion worth of ads
Right.
each year in the U.S. alone.
All
Oh
those
my God,
free
yeah.
services, and I don't need to mention specifics, but it's like that are paying with ads. They're trying to figure out how to make a profit through advertising.
And that's the thing.
course.
It's like, I don't know about you guys, but I remember, being a kid and remember people saying the old adage, nothing's free, right? I mean, you're paying for it somehow.
Right.
And I would much rather pay for my services. I mean, some of the services I have, music, movies, and it's like, if there's any option to pay for it so I'm not exposed to ads, I just am like, give me, take my money,
Yeah.
like it's like, I don't want the ad experience.
It's so
because I
true.
hate being subjected to it. And even browsers and stuff, I'm happy to say I install the ad blockers and you get these websites like, oh, don't you want to whitelist us? Turn off your ad blocker. And it's like, sorry, I don't really want to. If you give me a service that I think is worth paying for, I'd rather just give you
Right.
money. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to sit here and stare at your ads. Is your service worth paying for, or is it not?
If it has genuine value, it should be worth an actual dollar amount in a capitalist society,
Yeah.
right?
So we got to this topic with respect to ads through memes, correct? Like we were talking
Yeah.
about memes as a whole. I mean, in memes, I think.
Well, and advertisers using appeal to emotion in
Right.
their arguments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's. I mean, I think that one of the biggest things that we've seen, I think, with advertising, kind of making this biggest jump, has a lot to do with the fact that it's so easy now to have these bite-sized, like the 5,000. I mean, 5,000 ads per day. Like you go back to the 70s, people were watching ads or consuming ads in a very restricted
Oh yeah,
means.
TV, radio, not like
Magazines,
every well,
maybe
those
magazine
kinds of-
or
yeah,
newspaper.
right,
newspapers.
yeah.
Like so you have all of the like now you have all of those things still, and then you multiply that times your iPads and your iPhones and everything else and every
Yeah.
other platform that you use. You can even be playing
It's everywhere you are.
Yeah, you're playing a game on your phone.
It's like the Visa thing. It's
Yeah.
everywhere you want to be.
Right.
It's
And
just
everywhere you
everywhere.
don't want it to be.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But the appeal to emotion, I mean, it just becomes so much easier at that point, I think, in many respects.
Yeah.
And a lot of things, like, I think that consumerism as a whole, I mean, appealing to the emotion is like, oh, well, hey, you wanted this, right? Like, this is something that you, and that I think is the tailor-made ads now. Like, everything tracks you now at this point.
That's the insidious thing. It's like, hey, you asked for this, didn't you?
Oh, Richard
and it's
Dawkins.
like,
Yeah.
but you're also manipulating their behavior and then saying, oh, but hey, isn't this what you asked for? Yeah, because you manipulated me into wanting it in the first place.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up. I didn't know if you had seen this before.
Oh, yeah, this is
Richard
good, yeah.
Dawkins,
Yeah.
coined the term meme as a basically, a memory gene, and so I think that's interesting because I think he was even saying that it takes on some of the characteristics of a gene. First I put it in his book, The Selfish Gene,
Which was
from
in 76,
1976. Yep, exactly. And talks about how it also replicates and sort of carries on and even maybe takes some of the characteristics of a virus in some cases.
Yeah, for
just
sure.
sort of gets into people's heads and replicates whether they think they want it or not. I've heard some people bring that up. I don't know that I really like using the analogy of a virus because that implies that you have no control over it. some things I think, we can be exposed to. I've heard people bring up like, well, it's like that song that you hate, but it gets stuck in your head. And I mean, there is
like
some
earworm.
Yeah, there is something to be said for that. I mean, sometimes we are exposed to things that are like, no, I resist, except it does sort of take effect.
I think that's a good point. So virus, like I think always implies a negative connotation. And some things can spread.
Case in point, pandemic.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly.
How did we get on this topic?
Why don't people like viruses? Yeah. So, but there are things that are, mimetically positive. Like if
mimetically?
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to genetically. Yeah. It's good that you asked that though, so to clarify the take on the root word.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, like singing kids songs to kids that like help them learn their ABCs, like ABC.
Oh, totally.
And it gets stuck in their head, and it helps them learn the language.
Oh my God,
course,
Sesame Street,
Yeah,
still to this day, uno, dos, tres, cuatro. Oh my God.
Exactly. We could sing the whole thing right now,
Right.
but it helped us. It's
course.
like so. And I think that's the thing with like things like social media. Like we have to be careful to not just paint everything like a broad brush, just like a political extremist. We have to acknowledge where some things maybe are good and some things like, maybe we should pull this back a bit. How should we do this differently?
So I mean, are we espousing that we should use memes as a option for combating fundamentalism?
I'm not. I think that that's the thing is like people are using them whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
True.
And that's the really frustrating thing I think with all of this too is that if you identify something where like, hey, that's fighting dirty, that's some dirty tactics there, where somebody's is using an appeal to emotion or other sort of plays, whether it's a meme or propaganda or whatever. I think, certainly there's an argument to say, okay, there's a time and a place. Obviously propaganda, memes, things like that are not going to go away. And to say that appeal to emotion is a fallacy is not to say that it should never be used. There are times where, I do want to appeal to your emotion. Like, hey, donate to this charity because there are people that are really suffering and, your donation could help out a lot. That's not really a fallacy. That's just pointing out that, hey, I see you as a human and I know that you have compassion and, I'm going to say, hey, maybe you should donate to help these people that are suffering.
Yeah.
And I think
agree.
I think that there's a difference though. I think that that's where the fallacy versus like actually the title of the fallacy is
right.
the problem. Like you have the title of the fallacy of appealing to somebody's emotions. Like you want somebody to be sympathetic. You want them to empathize with other humans in different human conditions, and human suffrage as a whole. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want...
Suffrage is the right to vote.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I'm sorry. Suffering.
Yeah. Oh, another good clarification.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. But whenever you are using appeal to emotion, and the example that they're using here is like, oh, well, you need to eat something because if you don't eat something, there are other people that are starving. It's like there's... The problem with that fallacy is that person isn't going to benefit from you eating your food. Mm-hmm. And using that as a means to guilt you into doing something is part of the fallacy as a whole. Yeah. You can't appealing to someone's emotion as a means of saying, hey, like if you do this, like you will actually make a tangible difference in somebody's life. I think that that's a bigger difference than saying if you don't do this or if you're doing this, you're actually causing some other effect on the other side of the world. And whenever there really isn't any reason to believe that that's true.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a distinction, though I would say that the thing that they have in common is that they're both techniques of persuasion. And I think that's what it is. And technique. So it's, I think, interesting to talk about, an appeal to emotion as a fallacy versus just sort of persuasion that we might do for something that we see as, maybe really valid or a good thing that we would applaud. I mean, I think there are times where
I have a thought on that.
It's it can be appropriate. That was my point, and it just kind of comes back to just because something is a fallacy or a reason, even as a persuasion technique, doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. Mm-hmm. we've brought up the fallacy before too, and that's basically
Right.
what that is, right?
Yeah.
So I can make an argument and use appeal to emotion. It doesn't invalidate my argument. It's just it also helps to identify that that's a technique being used. And so if we talk about advertising, advertising uses appeal to emotion. I mean, I've actually heard some people advocate that things like appeal to emotion should be outlawed in our media. Well, I mean, that's interesting, but if you say, like, especially like, the news, like you say, oh, well, the evening news shouldn't be able to do that, or they should only make logical arguments. It's like, well, I don't want to go so far as to say that we should outlaw it, because there are times where it makes sense, especially in advertising. Like, hey, if I'm trying to sell a product and I say, hey, this is going to make you feel better as a person, maybe it really will. I mean, emotions are not invalid.
Well, right, because how do you interpret that? Because, I mean, if, some pundit gets teary-eyed after 9/11 and reports the news and can't hold his emotions back, is he making an appeal to emotion now?
Right.
So you have to look at the intent, I think, is one thing. And I think the other thing is, what's the substance behind the thing? So it's like, I think a lot of times we confuse style for substance and say, oh, well, because someone's using propaganda, it must not have value. And it's like, hey, I might cry at a soap commercial because, like I'm a sensitive guy or whatever, right? But like I can understand that it's not going to give me like pure happiness in my family, and then still see that the soap product has value.
Wait, do you often cry during soap commercials?
No comment. I'm not throwing that out there.
That is so good for everybody.
It's just the way that she's holding her down. Oh my God, it's just amazing.
It's just your sensitive skin from the harsh soap. Oh my God, it hurts so badly.
Yeah, they're promoting
this soap is making me soft.
Positive body image. Oh my God.
They should have like a billboard or something with just positive body image stuff. Yeah. I think it also gets back to this idea. There's a Latin phrase called cui bono, which means who benefits. Right. So I think with some advertising, it's like it's exclusively for the benefit of the advertisers. Right. And they're offering you convenience, but is it really improving society? And then, we've gotten to a point now where a lot of our things are not actually providing real quality. They're providing diversions and distractions and addictions. Yeah. And I think that's when it tips over.
I really like that Latin phrase. I've actually, it's a good reminder, because I think that's a good one to just take in into your perspective and anything that you're doing. A lot of the time, I mean, with respect, especially with respect to ads, but I mean, like, look at the things that we are being kind of seeing a lot more now in the political landscape as well. Like, who benefits from these thoughts? Who benefits from this particular ad?
Well, I do, of course.
Right.
Right, exactly.
But like,
I mean, they're not talking about Joe the plumber for Joe.
Yeah, they're not talking about it for him. They're talking about it for themselves, so that they can appeal to your emotions, so that they can get themselves elected. Yeah. Those are things that are really important to kind of bring in your own level of skepticism, healthy skepticism. Yeah. And that's an easy question to ask anytime you feel like as if maybe something's getting a little bit too soapboxy. You're starting to kind of hear it, and you're like, oh, that's back to the soap. So good. Yeah. But
skepticism, I think is an important
but it's
thing.
an easy question to always, like, if you keep that one in mind, I think it's an easy one, especially in our current landscape with ads and with everything else out there. Who benefits is an easy question to keep in the back of your mind as you're listening to a conversation or an argument being made in a singular direction. Because it is easy. It's an easy one if you don't have all the tools of being able to look up which fallacy it is or otherwise. Just who benefits from this particular talking point? Yeah. Who benefits from this perspective?
Well, and skepticism, too, I think is just a healthy way of looking at things, too, because you don't need to have, like you say, all of the fallacies. Even looking at some of these things, I love, kind of bringing this into conversations, because I think they're just sort of tools in your toolbox. But as you point out, they're not needed. These are just things that other people have come up with to identify sort of maybe errors that we could say in thinking or in logical thought.
It's a formalization. Really.
Formalization, exactly. But I mean, you don't need it necessarily to start asking questions and say, what do I think about this? And like you say, even if you just ask the question, like, who benefits here? Like in terms of like, if I take an action or a certain thought or somebody's trying to persuade me to a certain thing, like, okay, is that going to benefit me or somebody else that I care about? Or is this, benefiting somebody that's just trying to, take in a bunch of money? I mean, like, there's a lot of different things there that you could say, okay, I'm going to really question this and figure out if somebody's trying to sell me a loaded bill of goods.
Yeah. I mean, and the skepticism, honestly, like, I mean, you can almost reduce your skepticism to just asking the question from a childlike perspective of the why. I mean, it's the annoying why that you don't necessarily like from the toddler that's growing up all the time, but they have a reason. They don't really have a worldview yet. They don't have any understanding as to why that is something that they should not do versus what they should do.
Yeah.
And so I think that if you, it's difficult, I think, as you get older, whenever you start to have your own experiences underneath of you, to still be thinking, why?
Right.
But if you really want to have
keep asking that and keep regressing, it sort of cascades. And you're
exactly.
Like, well, why is it like this? Oh, because. Why? Oh, well, because of this. Oh, why? And then you keep cascading down, and it's like, and until somebody's like, well, I don't really know. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah, Louis C.K., I hope I can still say his name, despite, hopefully, I don't get arrested for just mentioning him. But he is an amazing comic, and I think this will illustrate the point, despite whatever, trouble he's gotten into. So anyway, he has this whole thing about the child asking why, and it's like, why? And he's like, and eventually after a while, it just gets really existential, it's like, well, like, because like, like, why am I, dumb? Like, because I didn't study enough in school. I don't know all the things, and it's like, why? Because some things are and some things aren't. You can't have an isn't, you can't have an are not, but I think that in all seriousness, what the toddler is trying to get to is some kind of foundation or bedrock. Right. And that's really what we adults do if we're using something like Six Sigma. It encourages us to ask why so that we get to the root cause of something. Yeah. Right. We're trying to get to bedrock, something that we can stand on and say, okay, this might not be the ultimate truth, but it's solid enough I can stand on it reliably and I can test it, and it pushes back.
Mm-hmm. That reminded me of a comedy sketch from Seinfeld. You're talking about that too. I know we're just talking about different comics, but in one of his comedy sketches, he says, it's always funny when somebody uses the same word twice in a sentence, like, it is what it is, or a deal's a deal. He's like, maybe it is what it isn't. Mm-hmm. Ooh. I know.
Yeah, I always hate when people use that "it is what it is" because it's almost
you're not saying anything,
You're
right?
saying nothing. It is nothing.
Yeah, if you're using it like almost in a Zen philosophy way, it can be profound because it's like it's essentially a bid for acceptance. Like, some things just are, and those are the rules of the universe around you. And the best approach is to accept what is rather than asking for what isn't. It's like when you're playing a game of Scrabble and someone says, oh, well, if you had such and such a tile on your thing, you could play this. Well, I don't have those tiles.
Yeah.
This board is what it is, And it's not me wishing.
I have the characters on my thing
Yeah,
here.
exactly. Yeah. Me wishing it a different way is not going to make it a different way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's a good cap for our conversation, kind of saying like, there are things the way they are. And I mean, some things you can't change, and you have to keep asking about, what the things are as they are.
Exactly.
to extend that.
For sure.
Keep asking the questions and look for, those things that might be trying to sway you with certain kinds of fallacies.
Well, I mean, as you're talking to other people, again, like, you're try to remember that maybe there's a bit of skepticism that they've lost.
Yeah.
And that's something you're not necessarily trying to bring in something that's like, you need to believe this or you're not going to know the correct truth or something. Yeah. You want to talk to them.
And I think asking questions, you know, and just like you say, why is a great question, but even
why
just
is a great question.
maybe even more put together questions are okay too, but it just kind of trying to, figure out where somebody stands and how they got there is a great place to start.
Well, and that is the interesting irony, that the more that you push against someone in a relationship and the more that you challenge them and test what the boundaries are and find out what those boundaries are, the safer you feel. Right. Because now it's like, oh, hey, that person, there's the limits, and now I know I have comfort in that.
Yeah, you can find those. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
We'll I had a great time.
Yeah, I know. This was a lot of fun. So we'll pick up on this next week and kind of figure out where we take it from there.
Perfect.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Bye.